Hello everyone and welcome to SUGTalks, the official podcast of the UK and Ireland SAP User Group, a not-for-profit membership organisation designed to help you get the very best out of your SAP investments. Our focus is bringing the whole of the SAP community together so our members can learn, network and collaborate to improve their organisation and make their job easier, providing an independent channel through which to influence SAP. I'm Craig Dale, your host and Chief Executive of the User Group, and together with our special guests, we'll take a deep dive into topics, challenges and opportunities facing SAP users today. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Andy Steer of itelligence, who is the Principal Architect and Evangelist of the itelligence UK Technology Strategy. Shin Soni of Capgemini, who leads the SAP Centre of Excellence in the UK. And Matthew Dobbins, the Head of Delivery Management of SAP UK and Ireland. So thank you all for joining me today. And before we move on to our main topic of discussion, I'm interested to find out a little bit about each of you. And I've started thinking about my lunch yesterday, which was a lovely roast beef and horseradish sandwich. You know, I'm often thinking about food. So a little question for each of you to get us started. What's your favourite sandwich? Andy.
Oh, why did you have to come to me first, Craig? What's my favourite sandwich? Well, I guess if I say my favourite sandwich by definition of which one I probably eat more often than any other, I guess similar to other people on the call, I pre-lockdown spent a lot of time travelling around, and often the motorway services at lunchtime was often your favourite friend. And I have to go early with no commercial endorsements and say I always looked out for the M&S BP garage, and I would have to say the chicken and bacon M&S sandwich is probably my go-to.
Oh, nice. Is that the Chicken and Bacon Club?
No, that's too posh for me. There's too much bread, too much bread in the club sandwich, and I believe it's also got that green lettuce and stuff in it as well. No, this is bacon, chicken, bit of mayonnaise.
Oh, very nice. Matthew.
Well, I cast my mind back to when I was a student, and I was fortunate enough to be on an exchange program in America, and part of my keeping myself busy outside of study time was working in a deli bar, where I had the best sandwich ever. It was rye bread, butter, hot pastrami, sauerkraut, and a little bit of mustard mayonnaise. And to date, I've never had a better sandwich than what I had over 30 years ago. So that's my favourite sandwich.
Wow. So is that kind of, you hear the pastrami on rye or whatever, is that like taking that to another level?
Well, for America, that was just a basic sandwich. I mean, for here, this would be, a monumental, enormous sandwich. For America, it's normal. I'd say it was probably about that, probably a couple of inches thick. And of course, it was delicious.
Oh, incredible. Shin.
Oh, look, I haven't got a very exciting story like Matthew's, unfortunately. My favourite is a tuna crunch, which is a tuna mayo with a host of veg and onions, which is the thing I like. The one addition I carry with me, though, and it's in my bag when I was travelling around, but it's at home full time, is a little pot of Tabasco sauce, because everything, unfortunately, has to be spicy. That's part of my Indian background coming out.
Oh, wow. So I wouldn't want to eat cornflakes with you, but interesting.
I don't put it on that.
Oh, well, thanks very much, guys, for that insight. Very, very interesting. And, thanks. And moving on to our main topic conversation for today, which is not letting a global pandemic pause your projects. In our member survey towards the end of last year, God, that seems a long ago already, probably measured in the number of lockdowns we've had since then. The COVID-19 pandemic's impacted projects in many organisations, with 30% of our members saying it specifically delayed their journey to SAP S/4HANA. And, you know, we see different things, and we know that you're able to continue in that delivery. And what are you seeing from your customers, Shin?
So, Craig, look, you know, clearly once the pandemic hit, the immediate focus was on business continuity, keeping the lights on, and understanding the impact on the business. And clearly the focus was on provisioning working from home. That was not just for our customers, but for ourselves. We had to get a whole host of our India colleagues, you know, couriered with laptops, etc., because they just couldn't travel. But, you know, projects that were ongoing, we saw continuing clearly, but in a very different way. But a whole host of new projects that were due to start were all, you know, did see a massive shift right. But as we got into later in Q3 and into Q4 and now, we are seeing a number of new projects starting, some of those even greenfield S4 some advisory, but all of them based on new virtual ways of working.
Okay, thank you. And Andy, a similar experience?
Yeah, I'd echo many of the things that Shin said. Actually, we saw the whole spectrum of possible responses. So, as Shin said, there was a lot of logistical work initially with people getting remote distributed work up and running in their organizations, and that happened very, very quickly. And I was surprised but impressed by the reaction that we saw across our customer base, how ready they were prepared to do it, and if they weren't prepared, how quickly they could get themselves in the position. But I think what we did see was a real differentiation between customers who wanted to be proactive around the situation and people who were being reactive around it. So the reactive customers tended to slow down because they weren't really sure what they were going to do. The proactive ones, very often, we found that certain other projects were being stopped or slowed down, and they would reassign resource to the SAP projects because they were seen as critical, so they could move quicker on some of those. So the slight paradoxical thing is that we saw both projects in some cases slow down, but in other cases accelerate because they were seen as being aligned to things that would improve the response during pandemic. So customer experience, for example, being a key one.
No, interesting. Yes, and like you both said, that, you know, that change, that I suppose that forced change that the pandemic brought. You know, I've heard of, you know, discussing it with some of our members, that they were saying that their organisation moved forward within the space of about 2 weeks, which would ordinarily take them 2 years in that business as usual environment. And Matthew, from obviously the whole of SAP's customer base and customers you're working with, what have you seen?
Well, we were in the middle of a very large program and literally weeks away from go live. And so that for me was a priority when we got the notice from the government that no travel was going to be coming. And in fact, we'd anticipated this. And I remember sitting down with one of my program directors, and our first thought was safety of staff, and also we had a load of staff that were traveling into the UK from America, India, Germany, Spain. And we thought if there's going to be travel restrictions, we would have staff in the wrong place for go live. So we made a decision and we discussed it with our customer and said we need to send everybody home because there's a chance they won't go home. But we also needed to send everybody home for their own safety, because if they got ill, they wouldn't have been able to help out with the go live. And that was replicated across a number of other projects as well. But there was one in particular, which was a very important, very significant go live. So by putting our staff safety first, and we had to explain this to the customer, we were putting their project and the customer first, because without the staff, if they'd gone off ill or in the wrong place, they couldn't support the go live. So that was our main priority. It became a very tactical situation for about 2 weeks to make sure that we sent people home so they could get home. They stayed safe. Fortunately, in SAP, everybody has a mobile, a laptop, broadband. So provisioning the ability to work remotely was not a problem, but ensuring their safety was the paramount and important thing to do. And the customer at the time, they were surprised at our decision and how quickly we made that decision. But when we'd explained, if we don't do it, then go live is at risk. They felt initially by doing it, go live would be at risk. But as time showed, we did the right thing. And we went live, no problem. And in fact, this year, 2020, we've gone live about a dozen times with different customers.
Excellent, thank you. And I would tend to agree there that, you know, it's your people first. You've got to put your people first and their safety. And by doing that, what you've shown there is that actually the project was delivered. And did it go live on time?
Absolutely, without a hitch.
Brilliant. That's great news, and just shows you that looking after your people, then your people look after you. Okay, we talked about that impact. We've talked about, you mentioned there, Andy, about proactiveness and reactiveness, and lots of customers we've heard of are just continue the projects and, like you said, switch their environment. What have you seen around that remote delivery of projects?
Well, so without wishing to sort of reverse into pedant's corner, I think one of the things that we do is we make a bit of a differentiation between remote delivery and distributed delivery.
Okay.
So if I just briefly explain what we mean by that, I guess our general understanding of remote delivery is sort of almost a nodes in a network approach, right? Where you've got a cluster of people generally at a customer site, and then you've got clusters of people at other, let's call them offices, because they generally are, and you're working remotely. And it's sort of that nodes in a network type scenario. But that's not really what we're talking about at all here. What we're talking about is fully distributed delivery, which, as Matthew was mentioning, is basically people either sitting around in a nice office they've got at home, or around their kitchen table, or trying to steal some space off the end of the kitchen worktop that they're sharing with their kids when they're schooling from home. That's a completely different delivery model. That is not, in my view, that's not remote delivery. And I think the first thing that we did very early on was we recognized that over the last 3 or 4 years, we'd actually pretty successfully been adopting a distributed delivery model anyway. We have a distributed support function in the UK, which networks into our global support function. The majority of them are home workers. We also have found that over the last few years, with many of our customers wanting to focus on cost control on their SAP initiatives, many of them have been looking for us to be working distributed, maybe not 5 days a week, but certainly some days a week. So what that meant was that our culture internally meant that we could pivot to distributed very easily. So the actual bread and butter of getting the work done for us was pretty straightforward. The challenges and the experiences, if you like, were very often the customers, particularly our more, let's say, traditional industry customers, they'd never done that. We're talking about, in some cases, customers who still roll out desktops to their staff. So they had never done that at all, including, customers where they don't have work mobile phones, for example.
Yeah.
So that was a really interesting challenge. But luckily, we were able to lift a huge amount of the cultural learnings we've had about how we run things distributed and help our customers to take those things on board. So that really helped us in this move to distributed piece. And I'm sure there are things we could talk about the technologies that underline it, use of MS Teams throughout for conferencing, and tools like Jira and Mural and Trello and all of these kind of things. But ultimately, they sort of support a culture. And the big thing was the culture of people being being aware of what distributed working means, and of course, coming to the reality of it being full-time distributed, with them not being the only person in their house. You know, they're having to share their house with their, you know, their kids if they got kids, with homeschooling. So those were the challenges we saw on our side and on the customer side. But I always stress this difference between remote working and distributed working.
I certainly like that. I think that is quite an interesting take on that. And Matthew, do you see a line with that? How do you see that, SAP?
Yes, I think Andy makes a very good point about distributed working. I mean, if we think back in the IT industry, remote working has been around for 20 years, offshore working, you know, and it's given us huge advantages in using technology to allow us access to a wider workforce, and, you know, the best and brightest from Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, India, China. You know, we've got remote working down to a fine art, because we've got remote delivery centers all around the world. But this pandemic brought in a different type of remote working, and I absolutely agree with Andy, you know, distributed remote working, because we weren't only just asking delivery teams, development teams, that they would be working remotely. We're asking our project managers, our architects, and our customers to all be working remotely. But that said, it brought with it some really interesting advantages, you know, and some of those advantages were really quite simple. You know, people were saving on average an hour, 2 hours a day in travel. They could use their time more efficiently. I mean, we're not trying to, you know, get more out of people, but give them a better work-life balance. And that made things, I think, a lot, in spite of everything that was going on, that made life and work life easier for people. But some of the advantages we then realized, and I've got project managers, some are early risers, some are late risers. I actually had project managers choosing to change their work time so they could work on projects in America or work on projects in Malaysia. And so we actually found that this remote working presented greater flexibility to fit in with the hours that people wanted to do. And of course, there's a financial benefit here, the cost savings in terms of expenses. You know, for a lot of our projects, the expenses have been zero. So there has been some, you know, good advantages. But that said, there are things that we have to do and take on board with this new remote working and new distributed working to ensure that it continues in an efficient manner.
Yeah, that very interesting. And Chin, I'd just like to just flip back to something Andy was talking about, and that's the culture. And, you know, the culture of an organization and delivery. Because I'm sure that, you know, there are lots of advantages, as Matthew was talking to, and they're there, but also there's often that, is it like that safe feeling you get when people are actually on site working with you in the same room, in the same environment. So that culture shift is often, I suppose, difficult for some people. But how are you seeing it with your customers and embracing that?
Yeah, look, I think the guys have made some really good points. But in terms of adopting that culture, it is, you know, a mindset shift. I think what's happened with COVID has probably accelerated our digital way of working probably by 5 years. We've had Andy talked about Teams and Mural and Klaxon and various tools that lots of people use, but probably didn't use them in a very efficient way or a full way. And actually now we're starting to see and adopting those technologies, even MS Teams, you know, people putting on, using all of the capabilities that's within Teams, not just the communication, but all the collaboration pieces has become really, really important to our customers and to ourselves as teams. And going back to the point about the distributed delivery, you know, it really starts to get exciting in a way when you start thinking about things like workshops. You know, when you're doing a design or a discovery phase with a client, typically you have workshops, you have a whole host of post-its around the wall, people sometimes not fully aligned to where we're getting to, and what the actions are. And then at the end of a workshop, you have to write it all up, and then present it back. Think of it now, the workshops we're running, and we've done some amazing stuff using the technology. Everybody's focused on the same board. They can see what's happening with the overall solution thinking that's coming out, and everybody's focused on exactly the same thing, which in a standard workshop environment wasn't the case. But it does come back to something we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a while more. Much more importance on planning and defining what outcomes you're trying to get out of those collaborations and out of those virtual setups.
Yeah, Matthew.
Yeah, I think Shin makes a very good point about the workshops. What we found, I think, and if I cast my mind back to projects that we thought we were going to kick off in about April time last year, there was resistance, if that's the right word, uncertainty. How could a customer kick off a project when nobody was going to be on site? And with a particular customer, we sat down with them and said, you know what, we need to come up with some guidelines for those workshops so that everybody understands that you can do this. And the way to do it is to have smaller workshops, smaller audiences in the workshops. Only limit those workshops to 2 hours maximum with a break. Ensure that you have time to pause, creating gaps for people to ask questions. Ensure that you have a wrap up at the end of the workshop, not just in the Teams meeting, but also an email follow up. And then ensure that when you're in the workshop, it's interactive. It isn't presenting PowerPoint and then one person talking at everybody. You have to make those workshops really interactive. And we came up with a 12-point list of this is the guideline for doing workshops. And actually, we run workshops very successfully remotely. And I think a key thing as well is using the technology like Teams, where you're on camera and you can see people, because then you still got that interaction. But there's no reason to stop kicking off projects, to stop doing workshops, because you're all working remotely. Have those guidelines and trial it initially, and then you'll hone it so that you can do successfully run workshops and kick off your projects. The technology will allow it and the discipline will allow it. And of course, make sure there's pre-work that people do before those workshops and they understand the reasons for those workshops. But I'll pause there.
Thank you, Matthew. And I'd be interested in seeing that 12-point list if you are able to share, and we could maybe distribute it along with the podcast. Andy, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think it's important to be very balanced in these conversations, is the first thing that I would say. So, our experience has been net positive, but I think there's something that I think is very important to mention here in this shift to remote stroke distributed work, which is for many people during the pandemic and the lockdown, it was a very worrying time. And for lots of our employees and lots of my colleagues, it was obvious that this wasn't the way that they had chosen to work. Many of them enjoy the variation of moving around different parts of the country and meeting new people, and they thrive on those interpersonal relationships. And I think it's entered common parlance now, but Zoom fatigue, when you're on camera all day and you're not used to that, and being stuck in for some of my colleagues, being stuck in a single bedroom in a shared house, for example. So one of the things that we were very, very pleased from an outcome perspective was that we'd implemented an employee wellbeing program a number of years ago. And what we found was that the reliance on that and the uptake on that grew exponentially during the lockdown time, because a lot of people were struggling. And I think it was important that we had those those safety nets in there to help people, because, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, but the manager couldn't spot you were struggling on site and take you for a beer in the hotel that evening. You just don't have that. So, those sort of safety nets. So we were running Qualtrics employee pulses internally, for example, and paying a lot of attention to that. And our HR team, their touch points through management to the teams went up massively, because we needed to make sure people were managing that adjustment. So as I say, net positive for sure, absolutely. But I think it's very important that we all recognize that this wasn't a voluntary thing, and it wasn't something that everybody went into eyes open, smiling, loving it. It was a challenging time.
I would totally agree with that. And, the isolation element, and, people are motivated by different things, as you said very early on there, about, why they do what they do and why they want to do what they do. And very interesting, we've recorded a 2-episode podcast around the impact of the pandemic on working and working from home, and the issues and how to go through it positively. And some of the points you mentioned there are discussed in that podcast. Maybe worth a listen when it comes out. But definitely, I would agree that. So just going back to what we were talking about there around perhaps the future and how this has changed, as you say, Andy, this has probably been forced upon everybody. But for the future outlook, do we see the way that, if you like, projects are delivered and perhaps software is implemented, etc., now in customers? Do we see that changing the future in the long term? And I'll start with you, Shane.
Yeah, look, I think there is going to be, and there is a fundamental shift here. Where we would have projects, we're looking at projects now where typically we'd have people, as we're planning them to start now, we'd have people on site potentially 3 weeks out of 4. It's now, a week out of 3. So there is a fundamental shift that's going on, because some of the benefits you can get, the cost savings, the time savings of the commute, there are the disadvantages that Andy's talked about in terms of that sense of belonging, that community that needs to be done. But that's where, the need to build digital communities as part of this is going to be something that's just going to be, I think, progressing along now as the new norm. As I said a moment ago, I think this pandemic has changed our ways of working and accelerated that using technology by a mass factor. And Capgemini has done a bunch of research as well. We've got a research institute which Craig arrange to get the outputs to share on the podcast. But it's some fantastic stuff which is talking about just the ways of working, and it's got some great statistics. That we've seen. 70% of organizations are looking to adopt virtual ways of remote ways of working for their staff on an ongoing basis now, not just simply for the while the pandemic lasts. So I think there is a fundamental shift here, but it does come back to trying to bring some of the benefits of that joint, when you're face to face, that community feeling and that sense of belonging into the virtual world.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. Andy, any comments on that?
I think I'd echo. I mean, many of the key elements, Craig, have already been mentioned by both Matthew and Shin as we've gone through. I think, these concepts of the acceleration of change in delivery models that's been caused. But I think we've probably all seen that cartoon. I think it says, what's been the primary driver of digital transformation within your business? Is it the CIO or is it COVID-19? And I think that, if we're going to try and put a sunny smile on some of these things, I think for sure a lot of organizations who would never have agreed to distributed project delivery before had a simple binary choice. Do you want to continue your project? Yes or no? And many of them said, yes, we have to. And the point has now been proven that these models can work. So as Matthew mentioned, lower expenses costs, lower travel costs, all of these things, it's impossible to ignore that in many, many scenarios, this has been a breakthrough for delivery. And we always use the analogy of it of it being, all of the consultants and all of the customers are all attached to their normal working places by a piece of elastic. And that elastic has been stretched to allow us to work in all these different places. For some people, that elastic will snap back quite quickly and pull them back to where they worked before. For others, it's stretched to a point now where it's comfortable and it will just stay like that. So whether that's offshoring, whether it's traditional remote delivery, whether it's distributed, whether it's more flexibility, all of those things, I think for sure are here to stay. And certainly speaking from the itelligence perspective, we're really pleased that they're here to stay because it offers huge benefits for both customers and for our colleagues as well.
And it certainly offers that benefit of choice as well. You've got more options, and whatever fits, going back to the culture, whatever fits the business culturally best in delivering that with the partners, it allows them more options in doing that. And we could probably go on talking about this for God knows how long, but we are coming towards the end of the pod. So I want to thank you all for your insights. And just in closing, just a quick fire round from each of you, if I may, and look at one top tip from each of you on planning and managing their SAP projects for success. So I'll start with you, Matthew, if I may.
I think I've got two, to be fair. I think
I'll allow two.
Thank you. So the first one I would say is trust. We need to have trust between us as a supplier and our customers. And it is based on this pandemic, it's out of date thinking that has driven the way we used to work, that if you didn't see somebody on site, they weren't working. We employ professionals, and those professionals actually, they really like working, and they like working hard. So trust is a key thing to ensure that customers trust the suppliers that they will be working. And I think to that end, you need to build a relationship with the customer in a different way. And building that relationship in a different way is through setting up one-to-ones on a weekly basis with the key people that need to speak. You need to give them time out from the project, because you can't just doorstep people now because you're not in the office. But a lot of, the safety netting that we used to have in the office was done by doorstepping people or getting things done. We can't do that. So you need to create an environment to do that, and setting up regular one-to-ones with key people from the customer and the supplier is absolutely essential. I do have a third one, but I won't go into that because I think it's you just need to expect it may take a bit more time.
No, thank you, Matthew. And Shin?
Look, I think one of the key things to think about is how you keep people engaged and contributing. So you've got to structure your engagements with the clients and within projects to ensure they're focused, they're driving purposeful outcomes, but they include lots of interaction and encouraging collaboration, which puts a massive focus on thinking about preparing. So a workshop's not a workshop now. A workshop should be seen as an event, something that I have to prepare for, as an example, and I have to make sure that I've got the right people in the right way, and engaging with them in a way that they are open to collaborating, which links back to the trust point that you have to trust us to do that. But I think that's kind of my top tip of what I'm seeing.
Thank you, Shin. And to finish off, Andy.
Oh, you let me go first on the sandwich one. With a chance of me picking the same sandwich as someone else is very slim. But I go last on this one. So listen, itelligence, our tagline, right, is transforming trust into value. So Matthew's blown my trust one, which was my default one to go with first of all. So then I'd thought, what am I going to do next? And I was talking about, when we're distributed and we're on camera all the time, everything's a performance. And you should remember that. And Shin went in with that one about the change and the way that works. So let me try and think of something else. So I guess whenever we approach SAP projects, the thing that we always focus on, whether we explicitly say it, the thing that we're always going for is that this is a business change program not a technology program, right? It might be driven underneath and supported by technology, but it's about changing the way that a business works. And I think the reality is, when we are working in these different delivery models, the reality is that making sure that that business change happens is actually even harder. So the change management, value acceleration activities to make sure that people understand what's changing for them, that's even more important and actually even harder. If somebody is sitting in their office where they do their normal day job all the time, talking to them about how that will change is hard. But when they're not even in their office and they're somewhere else dealing with a massive change that's happened already, and then you're trying to talk to them about another change, and they can't look their colleagues in the eye and have a chat offline afterwards, face to face, that makes that change management even harder. So I would say, or I always say, you've got to double down on that element on any style of project. But in this scenario, I think it's even more important.
Thank you. Thank all of you for, some real key insights there. And just to bring one thing that I think Shin mentioned earlier on into this element as well is, and I think you touched on it slightly in each of what you're saying, but look at the outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? And, that outcome focus and taking everybody on that project on the same journey to the same outcomes. And I think, bringing that back into here is a very important aspect too. So, thank you very much, guys. Thanks for your time. And, again, we're recording this distributedly in the midst of a pandemic and yet another lockdown here in the UK. So thank you for listening. And, for more information on UK ISUG, please do visit our website at www.sapusers.org. And until the next time, stay well, stay positive, and keep washing your hands.